For generations, the Middle Ages were framed as an age of ignorance, dark, unsanitary, technologically stagnant. That narrative is comfortable. It reassures us that modern infrastructure represents permanent progress. Yet as energy grids grow fragile, supply chains strain under geopolitical pressure, and food systems reveal structural weaknesses, a different reality emerges. Medieval communities operated in a world without centralized utilities, industrial fertilizers, refrigeration, or antibiotics, and they survived not by accident, but through systems thinking grounded in observation and repetition, hidden in history. Some of their methods were mocked, others were restricted, regulated, or outright banned, not because they failed, but because they redistributed power. They reduced dependence on centralized authority, guild monopolies, or royal supply chains. Today, modern physics, microbiology, and materials science are quietly confirming that many of these practices were not primitive improvisations. They were decentralized resilience strategies, and in a world that feels increasingly unstable, their logic deserves renewed attention. This is not nostalgia. It is structural analysis. When thermal mass outperformed fuel consumption, authorities preferred uniformity over efficiency. Across northern Europe, long before industrial heating, builders engineered structures that captured and stored heat with remarkable efficiency. In parts of Scandinavia and regions influenced by Norse settlement, techniques refined during the era associated with figures like Harald Hardrada persisted for centuries. Earth-sheltered dwellings and stone-lined hearth systems were not crude shelters, they were thermal instruments. Large masonry stoves and stone heaters absorbed heat from a single intense fire and released it slowly over many hours. The principle is simple thermodynamics. High thermal mass materials such as stone store energy and moderate temperature swings. Modern passive house design uses the same physics. In some growing medieval towns, especially in places like London and Paris, authorities discouraged certain construction styles that deviated from urban norms. Subterranean or semi-subterranean housing complicated taxation, property assessment, and fire regulation. Standardized timber or stone buildings were easier to categorize and control. Yet earth-sheltered homes manipulated ground temperature, which remains relatively stable below the frost line. Soil acted as insulation, dramatically reducing fuel needs. In an age where fuel gathering consumed time and labor, this was not aesthetic preference. It was energy security. Modern energy systems depend on continuous supply. Medieval thermal design depended on stored heat and insulation. When fuel was scarce, thermal mass kept families alive. The insight is straightforward. Reduce dependence on constant input, and resilience increases. When biological filtration replaced industrial-scale water treatment, control became the issue. Medieval communities lacked centralized water treatment plants, yet they developed layered approaches to water safety. Slow sand filtration, passing water through layers of sand and charcoal, was practiced in various forms long before industrialization. Boiling and fermentation added further safeguards. Fermented beverages such as small beer were common in medieval urban life. The boiling process reduced microbial load, while fermentation lowered pH and introduced alcohol, inhibiting certain pathogens. Long before the work of Louis Pasteur explained microbial mechanisms, empirical knowledge confirmed outcomes. In several cities, brewing was, tightly regulated. Guild structures controlled who could produce and sell ale. Unauthorized brewing was fined, or sometimes even banned. Officially, this was supposed to ensure quality and compliance with taxation. Functionally, though, it centralized what had once been household-level biological processing. The scientific principles behind these practices are now, pretty well established. Charcoal adsorption removes impurities. Sand filtration reduces turbidity and microbial presence. Fermentation alters chemical environments, making them hostile to pathogens. In modern crises, like natural disasters or infrastructure collapse, these low-tech systems reappear because they are modular and scalable. Medieval survival knowledge embedded microbiology into daily life, long before there were laboratories. When water security becomes fragile, distributed filtration really matters. When food preservation determined military endurance, monopolies, followed. Before refrigeration, preservation techniques determined whether communities endured winter or armies could extend their campaigns. Salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting weren't just culinary arts. They were logistical technologies. In maritime hubs such as Venice and Bergen, saltfish and preserved goods fueled trade networks stretching across Europe. Merchant guilds controlled production closely. Unauthorized curing or smoking operations were often restricted, ostensibly for quality or fire safety, but also to protect economic monopolies. From a biochemical perspective, salting reduces water activity, which inhibits microbial growth. Smoking introduces antimicrobial compounds, while drying further limits spoilage. Fermentation stabilizes nutrients and enhances shelf life. During conflicts like the 100 Years' War, preserved rations extended operational reach. Armies that could carry durable food supplies were less dependent on foraging or local harvests. Food preservation translated directly into strategic mobility. Modern supply chains operate on just-in-time delivery, but medieval systems operated on stored resilience. When centralized food distribution falters, preservation knowledge becomes, honestly, survival infrastructure. When nitrogen cycling blurred into weapons production, states stepped in. Saltpeter, potassium nitrate, became essential to gunpowder manufacture, prompting monarchies in countries such as France and England to assert strict control over its production. Royal agents would search private lands for nitrate-rich soil. Independent production was frequently prohibited. Yet the underlying knowledge of composting and nitrogen cycling extended way beyond explosives. Medieval agricultural practices recycled waste into nutrient-dense soil amendments. Farmers observed that decomposed organic matter restored fertility. Modern soil science confirms nitrogen as a limiting nutrient in plant growth. Medieval compost systems were, in effect, decentralized fertility engines. Control over nitrates meant control over both agriculture and warfare. By restricting independent nitrate cultivation, authorities limited not just gunpowder supply, but also the autonomy embedded in nutrient management. In periods of famine, access to soil fertility meant food security. When central authority controlled critical inputs, dependence only deepened. When clothing functioned as long-term infrastructure rather than disposable fashion, textile production in the medieval period was, incredibly labor-intensive and material-conscious. Wool garments, if they were properly woven and maintained, could honestly last for decades. Layering systems allowed for thermal regulation across the seasons, which was pretty clever. Linen undergarments improved hygiene by wicking moisture and reducing skin irritation. Guild regulations often controlled textile production and distribution. Quality standards protected reputations, but they also restricted who could manufacture durable goods. Independent or unauthorized production threatened the economic order. From a materials science perspective, wool's crimped fibers trap air, providing insulation even when damp. Lanolin adds water resistance. Linen's tensile strength and breathability enhance durability and hygiene. Modern fast fashion, on the other hand, prioritizes cost and turnover, while medieval textiles prioritized longevity. Clothing wasn't about seasonal expression, it was really portable shelter. In environments where exposure could be fatal, garments engineered to last decades represented stability. Durability reduced resource consumption and supply vulnerability. When forest survival practices were criminalized to consolidate land control, things changed dramatically. Following the Norman conquest under William the Conqueror, forest laws in England designated large areas as royal forests. Peasants faced severe penalties for hunting, gathering, or woodcutting without permission. Yet, subsistence practices, such as coppicing, cutting trees to stimulate regrowth, actually represented sustainable woodland management. Pannage allowed pigs to forage on acorns, converting otherwise unusable calories into protein. Modern ecology recognizes coppicing as a renewable system that enhances biodiversity and long-term productivity. Medieval communities had refined cyclical harvesting techniques over generations. Forest law was less about conservation than about exclusive rights. Restricting access increased peasant vulnerability during crop failures. When famine struck, woodland resources could mean survival. The banned practices were not reckless exploitation. They were adaptive environmental management strategies. When decentralized knowledge threatened centralized order, a clear pattern starts to emerge. Taken together, these examples reveal a consistent pattern. Medieval survival systems were distributed. Heat came from stored thermal mass. Water safety came from household-scale filtration and fermentation. Food security relied on preservation and soil fertility management. Clothing functioned as long-term insulation. Forest management operated on cyclical regeneration. Each system reduced reliance on centralized infrastructure. When authorities restricted or banned these practices, it was often to protect taxation structures, monopolies, or military control. The tension was not between ignorance and progress. It was between autonomy and centralization. Modern science has validated the physics of thermal mass, the microbiology of fermentation, the chemistry of preservation, and the ecology of coppicing. These were not accidents. They were iterative solutions developed under constraint. In an era when electrical grids can fail, supply chains can fracture, and technological dependence can become vulnerability, distributed resilience really regains relevance. This is not an argument to abandon modern systems. It is instead an acknowledgement that redundancy matters. Medieval communities survived without industrial backstops because their knowledge was embedded locally. Resilience was cultural, not corporate. Understanding these banned or restricted techniques forces a reassessment of the so-called dark centuries. They were not technologically barren. They were structurally different. And that difference matters, because survival has never depended solely on innovation. It depends on whether knowledge is concentrated or shared. If this kind of grounded, evidence-based analysis of overlooked history adds depth to how you think about the past and the present, subscribe to Hidden in History. And if you value serious historical inquiry over caricature, share this episode with someone who wants to understand how resilience was built long before the modern grid existed.